Alright, so I'm trying my hand at something a little bit different today, and I want you guys to be honest with me in the comments of this video regarding how you thought it worked out. I do theories a lot, and those are basically just essays, right? I state my thesis, which is the core theory, and then I give whatever background is necessary to understand where I'm coming from, and then my various points of interest, my various points of evidence. But I'd like to try my hand at some more straightforward video essays from time to time. And to kind of get a sense for how that would work out in my usual format, I decided to go with something that is very easy for me to talk about. This is something that I talk about in my real life a lot. I've talked about it a little bit in videos here on the channel, but I want to get all of my thoughts about it out all at once. So this one should be a fairly simple one. I have it written up here in my usual note-taking format. It's like I bullet pointed out everything I want to say rather than actually writing out an essay or a script. So regardless of whether or not I decide to go with that going forward for videos like this one should still work out pretty okay. This is a thing that, again, I'm very familiar with discussing. And I want to preface this entire video by saying I don't disparage anyone who likes streaming format, story-driven, no filler, no bullshit kinds of storytelling. There are definitely some shows that I feel work significantly better in that format. Like, look at Marvel's Daredevil on Netflix, for example. A really solid, dramatic show that doesn't have any filler. Like, there's some episodicness to it from time to time, but every single episode in that show is contributing directly to the overarching story of each season. And it's better for that, because even when the show takes steps back, even when there's misdirects, even when the characters get thrown off task and have to return to task later, everything is building towards something. And it feels that way, which replicates the feel of a limited series comic book. Like, even the Spider-Man Clone Saga always felt like it was building towards something. It always felt like each story was contributing towards something, even when it didn't end up being the case, and even when the things that it was contributing towards ended up being absolutely stupid. That's just how comic books work. So it was necessary for the shows based on them to replicate that feeling. And yet I see people in my comment section, even today, on shows that are completely different from those, like Amphibia, for example, disparaging filler. They use filler like a dirty word. And again, I mean no offense to you if you feel this way. I just think, one, some of you have the wrong idea about when filler should and shouldn't be applied. And also, two, you have the wrong idea about what filler is in the first place. So I guess the most important thing to get out of the way right out the gate is we need to define what filler is. Not technically, but colloquially, because we're going to be discussing it from a colloquial point of view in this video. And as far as I can tell, there seem to be two common uses for the word filler in a colloquial sense. The most common one, and the one that I see on videos like my reviews of Amphibia, and the one that is the least correct, and I'm sorry, but I do mean that objectively, you're wrong about it being filler if this is what you think filler is any episode of any show, episodic or otherwise, that doesn't contribute directly to the overarching plot of the show itself. Even if the overarching plot is mentioned, even if the characters still react as if it is hanging over their heads, even if they are shown preparing for it in some way or another, even just in the background, people call those episodes filler. And just for the sake of transparency, that's the definition of filler that I'm using for the vaguely clickbaity title of this video. That's what I mean when I'm talking about filler here. Because the other colloquial use for filler, and the one that is probably more technically correct overall, like just in general, in terms of the technical aspect of the word filler, is the one that was made famous by anime. Especially anime from like the 90s. That's usually when I think of it anyway. Stuff like Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. In fact, I'm going to use One Piece as an example in this video. Because the way anime is produced, adapting manga, at least this style of anime. Anyway, there's original anime that doesn't adapt from anything, but specifically anime which adapts from long-form manga. Even though that manga tends to be produced relatively fast, too fast in some cases, as it tends to absolutely ruin the lives of some of its creators and by how much they have to focus on the project. Adapting it on a weekly basis, a show which tends to run year-round most of the time, right? Those styles of shows never really go off the air for any length of time, still burns through the content in the manga very, very quickly, relatively speaking. That's why the storytelling in a martial arts anime, and for example, tends to be extremely decompressed. Only a couple of key things will actually occur in each episode, replicating the chapter style in the manga, but keep in mind that you read through a chapter of manga comparatively quickly relative to the length of a 22-minute episode of television. You could fit several chapters in an episode if you really wanted to. Look at Dragon Ball Z Kai as an example of that. And so what these various series would do about that is they would introduce entire filler arcs or filler episodes, stuff that was anime only, created specifically for the television show itself, that did exactly as the term suggests. It filled time. These arcs would put the characters from the manga in situations that they might have found themselves in the manga if things had gone a little bit differently. Good filler arcs tend to do that anyway. And the characters' actions in the filler arc can certainly be informed by things that have recently happened to them. They tend to be written in character fairly well for the most part in these filler arcs. But they also tend to repeat a lot of the story beats from other recent arcs. And they can't really grow as people. They can't develop new abilities. They can't develop new long-lasting relationships. And simply put, no future arc of the show is ever going to refer back to the filler arc. Because when the filler arc ends and you move on to the new buffer of actual canon material that you need to adapt, that material is never going to reference the events of the filler arc. So you can't either. And this is where I was talking about, I'm going to use One Piece as an example. There are some elements of the One Piece anime where they give us smaller amounts of filler. They'll fill out an episode with some stuff that wasn't in the manga, or they'll give us a couple of episodes of stuff that's mixed with a canon and filler material, so that they don't have to make the filler arcs too long, or they don't have to give us as many filler arcs overall. In fact, there haven't really been any filler arcs at all for a very long time in that show. And sometimes they will give us a bit of anime-only content that they do want to reference later, that isn't obtrusive into the story of the actual show, and they feel could actually serve to inform some of the characters' actions later in a positive way, so they make it anime-only canon. And it tends to work pretty well. Like, I've been rewatching One Piece with my mom, and no, that's not lame, shut up. And we've been using a filler list to skip filler so we can get straight to the good stuff. Because I don't remember what arcs are filler and what aren't, right? Not off the top of my head anyway. And I have never regretted ever watching any of that anime canon content, because it always feels like it belongs. And yet that is still technically filler. It is still technically filler of this lesser variety that is so maligned. Because simply put, with a few notable exceptions, most filler arcs, whether you personally enjoy them or not, are completely meaningless. Frankly, I would argue the anime that went most balls to the wall with their filler arcs, out of the various anime that I've actually watched, is probably Yu-Gi-Oh! Because they actually did something super interesting with their filler. The character of Kaiba, who was technically a main character for a good chunk of the manga, got so much more screen time in the filler and actually became closer to the other main characters. And even though canon stuff couldn't really acknowledge that most of the time, eventually it got to the point where you kind of had to, or it didn't make sense anymore. So he ended up being present for events and an active participant in events at the climax of the series that he wasn't a part of in the manga. And I thought it worked better. And then there's stuff like the Blackwater Mist saga from Dragon Ball Z that actually took an opportunity presented by Goku's absence from the manga to give us an entire arc where the characters like Piccolo and Gohan were the main focus of the story for a while. Something that Akira Toriyama always implied that he wanted to do, and just never did because Goku, I guess, is easier to write for. And even though there's definitely some stuff in that arc that contradicts stuff later, and therefore it can't technically be canon, I guess, I like to think that it is because it's just so interesting. But the fact of the matter is, these filler arcs and entire filler episodes, which are the more common one nowadays, do take away from our time focusing on the real story of the thing. And so I understand fully why the term filler has become such a negative one in fandoms. It has bled into fandoms that aren't anime-centric. And so it has just kind of become the general assumption when someone sees an episode which doesn't directly contribute to the overarching plot, that must be filler. And that's just not the case. Most shows, especially shows on Western television, at least until very recently, were episodic. They might have an overarching story, but they were still Monster of the Week or Problem of the Week style shows. One of the supreme examples of something like this, one of the first shows, the first mainstream shows, especially a mainstream show that was supposed to be accessible by younger people, was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. For most of its run, arguably right up until its final season, Buffy was a Monster of the Week show that still had some of the strongest story arcs I've ever seen. Star Trek Deep Space Nine is another great example. That show had an overarching story. The creators had it in mind from almost the very beginning. They wanted to give us an overarching story for a Star Trek show that challenged some of the ideas that the other shows took for granted. Is the future Earth really a utopia? Is the Federation really this force for peace and justice that it's always been portrayed to be? And while their plans were derailed occasionally by executive meddling, for the most part they kept to that, and yet the show was still primarily episodic. It's just that they used those episodes. They used the individual stories of those episodes to build character.
Death to the opposition!
So that those characters would have more informing them later on when the plot actually got going. The overarching plot. Because I want to make clear, that's the draw of an episodic show. Is that each episode has a plot. And I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous. It sounds like that's the thing he shouldn't have to say. But one of the things I keep seeing people complain about filler episodes, and again, keep in mind, I am using filler here to mean any episode that doesn't seem to meaningfully contribute to the overarching plot of the series, not episodes which literally don't matter. They always complain that filler isn't story. And that's just not true. Even episodes which are true filler, episodes which can be lifted out of a story completely, and the story wouldn't even have to shrug to acknowledge that, have stories. And if I like a character or a group of characters, I am always going to want more good stories with that character or those characters. That's always going to be true. Like, I don't want any show to overstay its welcome and get bad. No matter how much I might think so in the moment as the show is ending, I don't actually want any show to stretch on to the point that it becomes a shadow of its former self. But good stories with a clear beginning, middle, and end that all fit within the time frame of a single episode? Yes, I want those occasionally. I don't want the characters to always be in these stressful situations. I don't always want to see them making decisions under fire, for lack of a better metaphor. Sometimes I want to see what it's like in their downtime. Sometimes I want to see them interacting with people that they just wouldn't during plot-related stuff. Doing things that they wouldn't during plot-related stuff. Dealing with crises that they wouldn't during plot-related stuff. I want to see more of these characters' lives. I want to see more about how they live their lives in more typical kinds of situations, because that's where we learn about who these people are deep down. It's all well and good when the action climax starts to see how those character traits are applied in a crisis situation, but not everything can be a crisis situation. That doesn't give us our most complete look at the people we're watching. My favorite example for a show that needed more filler, in that colloquial sense of the word, is Star Trek Picard. Picard is a pretty good show. There are some things I really love about it, particularly 7 of 9, but I love 7 of 9 in general, so that's to be expected. But the fact of the matter is, by the time the first season of Picard ended, I couldn't have cared less about anybody who wasn't named 7 of 9 or Jean-Luc Picard. I spent more time when I was watching that show worried that some of these events might cause harm to Geordi LaForge in the background, even though he's not even in the series. Like when they brought in Riker and Troy for a single episode, I mean, Riker was in a second episode too, but he also kind of wasn't. It was clear he was just phoning it in, which is fine. But when they brought them in for a single episode, I was so worried that they were going to like kill him off or something to try and make us care about the new main characters in some weird roundabout way. I had to watch that episode twice all the way through before I could enjoy it. Because the ways that we were meant to connect with the other characters, the new characters in that show, always felt so cheap to me. Every single one of them, save for a couple notable examples, have some connection to some pre-existing Star Trek character, if they aren't a pre-existing Star Trek character themselves. Like, I care about Picard, and I care about 7 of 9 because I know them as people. I have seen how they react to things in more conventional situations. So I have some idea of how they might react in these crisis situations that they're facing now. I know what is informing their actions. I trust them, I believe in them, and I want to see them succeed. But characters like, I don't even remember her name, and she was my favorite new character of the bunch. The doctor played by Alison Pill. Agnes. Dr. Agnes. Agnes Girardi. There's a scene in Picard where she does something absolutely deplorable and realizes her mistake after the fact and reveals that she was being manipulated, and the other characters forgive her for what she did, and it seems implied they're going to protect her from legal ramifications because she's literally being manipulated by the spy group villain group of the entire show. And throughout that entire, it was over the course of a couple of episodes, technically speaking, that all this happened. Over the course of all of that, well, I wanted to believe her because I like her. My first impression of this character was, I like this character. I didn't believe her. I still am not sure I believe her, because I don't know the character well enough to know if I can trust her in this. It feels like this is still a brand new character who I am still getting first impressions of, and I'm supposed to be waiting to learn more about her so that I can know if I'm supposed to trust what she's saying here. This didn't feel like an endgame part of her character arc. It felt like the beginning still, because we never got to see her in any quote-unquote filler episodes. And yet this character, they tried to give us some sort of default level of caring about this character. One, she's the doofy, cute scientist type, which is endearing to a lot of people naturally, but she also has a past connection to a Star Trek The Next Generation character, Bruce Maddox, who, despite being a complete racist douchebag in his first appearance, and despite never appearing again after that, we do hear about him occasionally, and it does seem like he's becoming a better person. And so that's cool. That's a character who, despite the fact that we love to hate him, it was also kind of cool that he seemed to be getting better in the background, and we wanted to see that. And now we have this new character, Girardi, who's tied to him, and she is our gateway to seeing him again, and seeing if that's true, if he really did become this better, cool person. That's neat. We want to see that. And it feels like they were trying to use that desire to make us care about Girardi, and it just didn't work. The same goes for, again, practically everyone, but primarily Data's quote-unquote daughter. There's technically two of them, but only one of them becomes a recurring character. So that's the one I'm talking about here. And I like her. Again, my first impression of this character is that I like her. But I only really care about her because she's connected back to Data, the objectively best Star Trek character of all of them, tied with Seven of Nine, and everyone in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, of course. And like, yeah, we get a couple of episodes that focus specifically on her and build her character a bit. But that's before we find out her entire past is manufactured. We are given no episodic filler-esque characters after that reveal to get to know the real her and understand who she is outside of the context of a crisis situation. Like, I know she can be relied upon because she demonstrates that in those crisis situations, but I don't know who she is as a person, and that's a bummer. All of this is a huge bummer because Star Trek, around the time of Deep Space Nine, and even a little bit in Star Trek Enterprise, not Voyager though, seemed to have gotten to the point where it really understood that in a show with an ensemble cast full of people that we're supposed to care about, you need that blend of story episodes and quote-unquote filler episodes to truly understand these people and care about them when it comes crunch time. Like hell, even Star Trek Discovery does this right. Even as far back in the first season, which is the only season of that show that I think is really garbage, and I will never watch it again. Even then, and even though they only really ever focused on like 2 characters maybe total, and one of them disproportionately a lot, they still gave us filler-esque episodes, episodic style episodes that informed who those characters were. Which is so weird to me, because regardless of how much Discovery has tried to come off like an ensemble show recently, it's not. Burnham is the main character. Picard, though, is trying to give us a show with an ensemble cast. It feels like the 2 storytelling methods should be reversed. And I know none of this means anything to any of you if you don't watch Star Trek, so let me just put it this way. Like, hell, even Game of Thrones is a perfect example of this. The earlier season, everybody knows at least tangentially what Game of Thrones was like, right? That's bled so deeply into pop culture. You have to know, right? I hope I'm right. The first several seasons of that followed the book more, which the books are actually pretty episodic. Like, they feel like, I don't know, like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, where clearly multiple stories happen one after another within the pages of that one book. And the early seasons of the Game of Thrones show reflected that, with entire episodes with people just walking around from one point to another talking to each other. Entire episodes were devoted to getting to know these people. The show didn't turn to shit until later when they started cutting all that stuff out and just cutting right to the fat. Or would it be trimming the fat and cutting right to the meat of the thing? You get what I'm saying anyway. It was once all of that supposed filler was lifted out of the show and they just started rushing from one crisis point to the next that the show got bad. That's what something like Picard feels like to me. It feels like Star Trek the speed run that skips out on all the flavor text. And I am certainly not saying that shows should be almost entirely true filler that could be lifted out without the show even having to shrug to acknowledge it, like they used to be, like 80s shows, like the original Transformers, for example. Yeah, like there was the movie and there were a few episodes here or there that introduced a character and you kind of had to know their backstory for stuff that came later, or episodes which were building up to the finale, for example. Those episodes are story episodes that I would argue, even though they are kind of haphazard with their continuity, do have an impact on stuff later. You do have to see them to fully understand what's happening in some later episodes, but most episodes of that show were true filler. Like, they have a beginning, middle, and end, and some of them are great, some of them are enjoyable, and I would still defend those as worthwhile stories in and of themselves, but they don't mean anything to the overarching narrative of the show. Most of them could be completely removed. The bad ones in particular could be removed, and we'd be better off for it. And so I would never advocate for shows like that to come back, but I do think that any show with any degree of an episodic premise to it needs some episodes like that, that only mention the plot, the overarching plot, even if they do that much, and tell a complete story on their own. And I blame Netflix for this, frankly, because when they saw success with some shows, probably even stuff like Marvel's Daredevil, that was bingeable content, stuff that didn't have any fat on it. You could just chew right through it. This metaphor is getting stretched to hell and back. You get what I'm saying, though. They saw stuff like that work, and they pushed for it, and now everybody's emulating them. It's all Netflix's fault. Cancel Netflix, pirate media. I didn't say that. Pretend I didn't say that. It feels like television, visual media in general, is trying to push its way into a new era of storytelling. And I know part of this is just that I come from a different age where stories were told differently. But I don't accept that as an argument, because I genuinely feel like this is an objectively worse way of telling some stories. Again, some stories work better in this style, but some just don't. And Picard and the later seasons of Game of Thrones are perfect examples of that. They are perfect examples of things which, even if you like them, would be better if we spent more time with the people in them. So give us more shows with episodes which tell self-contained one-episode stories. Be careful that that's actually the kind of show you're making, but if it is, make it. And more than anything, we need to remove the stigma from the word filler. If filler is going to be used to mean those kinds of character-building one-shot episodes, then we need to remove the stigma from it, because those episodes are not inherently bad. Now, some shows can certainly go overboard with it, even if it is part of the premise. Star Trek Voyager, for example, told effectively the same character story for 7 of 9 roughly 12 billion times in different episodic filler episodes. Like, the episodes had different specific plots, and some of them are great. Don't get me wrong. The ones that do manage to break new ground tend to be pretty fantastic. But the ones which retread the same character development, even if they don't retread the same specific story, most of those don't need to be there. Now, I would argue that even Steven Universe started to do this, even though there tended to be some amount of character growth in each of the Townie episodes. Like, the characters would learn something here or there. They tended to learn very similar things over and over again. And a lot of those things didn't really seem to come into play later, when the characters found themselves in a crisis situation. So a lot of those episodes, whether they're good or not, in and of themselves, as standalone stories, probably don't need to be there. But some of them do. Some of them genuinely do. Like Lars and the Cool Kids is an episode in the style of a lot of the later Townie episodes, and it's one of the better character episodes of early Steven Universe. I feel like filler, the concept of filler as a standalone episode of a TV show, needs to be protected. And I feel like I'm the only one doing it. So, help me out, maybe? Can we try to destigmatize this word a little, please? This is where I want to end the episode, and I'm not sure how to sign off from this one. Should I just do the normal thing and ask, what do you guys think of the ideas that I presented in this video? I guess that works, right? What do you guys think of any of the ideas that I presented in this video? What are your thoughts on filler? Do you think I've got a point? Do you think I'm taking this too seriously? If you do, I know. I just want to. Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't, and again, of course, let me know what you thought of this more standard video essay format. Did you like it? Did you not? I'm very interested in knowing the answer to that. You can also check out the links to my various social medias and to all the different ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.